It must have been a despondent population of Romanized Britons who watched the legions leave the province to defend the crumbling frontiers of the empire closer to Rome. For 4 centuries, Britons had never had it so good. They'd become used to plenty of imported goods in the shops and markets. Communications had never been as good, and they lived comfortably in towns where the equivalent of the local authority looked after such things as planning permission and drains. In fact, they enjoyed all the civilized advantages of a highly developed economy based on a trading network that extended throughout the known world. But as we know, it wasn't to last. The Romans pulled out soon after 400 AD, and their legacy of organized urban life began to disintegrate, and Britain gradually slipped into that obscure period we call the Dark Ages. But those ages may not be as dark and as empty as we've come to accept. Archaeology during the past 10 years or so has been sensitive to this period, and one of those working in the field is Dr. Richard Hodges of Sheffield University.
The accepted view is of a slow decline in the 5th century, with the towns gradually becoming inhabited by squatters rather than an urban population, and with the contraction of what had been a nation into groups of small territories, like, for example, the Somerset territory, we assume commanded by King Arthur, the legendary King Arthur. And at the same time, of course, there's the series of invasions that began late in the 4th century and continued throughout the 5th century in a series of waves. It's a slow affair, 2 centuries that remain rather obscure, I suppose, in urban terms, but then historians have always drawn our attention in the 7th century and from then to the 9th century towards the fact that many of the monks who were writing of this period were living in towns, and that urban life was possibly restored around the 700s, possibly in the 800s as well.
It's these writers, of course, who have provided much of our knowledge on this period, but there can't be very much of that.
No, it's fairly scanty. There are the saints' lives that were written at that time, saints like St. Wilfrid, St. Willibrord, St. Boniface, etc. At the same time, there are land charters, very few of those, which are rare secular documents from the period, and 1 or 2 wills that survive from this period. From a slightly later period, there are chronicles that look back and reflect on the period, but by and large, it is very scarce, and there's very little detail.
To what extent, then, is archaeology adding to our knowledge of the Dark Ages?
Well, in a sense, it's rather contradicted some of the historical evidence. It's produced a great deal of negative evidence for urban revival from the 7th century onwards.
When you say negative evidence, what do you mean?
Well, they've excavated, or a number of archaeologists have excavated in Roman period towns all around the continent, in Holland, France, Germany, and of course in England. And instead of finding evidence of urban revival from 600 or 700 AD, instead there's been nothing, literally sterile layers.
Nothing until the medieval period, much later?
Nothing really until the 10th century, until the urban revival that is splendidly documented from the late Saxon period in England.
Well, with all this negative evidence to work with, what are you, as a specialist in this particular period, doing about it?
Well, there is one superb body of data that's come up. We've been especially fortunate in the last 10 years in England in having 2 exceptional sites surviving. There's Ipswich on the east coast, a site for which no documents survive, and which seems to have been a massive settlement for the period, possibly 60, 70 hectares. And at the same time, we've had the excavations in Hamwy, which have produced a settlement of equal size and dense occupation.
This is the Saxon town near Southampton?
That's right. A town that the Saxon town lay a little to the east of the present medieval and later town, rather in one of the suburbs by the side of the River Itchen.
Now these 2 towns, these 2 Saxon trading towns, have recently been discovered.
Hamwy has been known for a number of years, but not fully explored. By contrast, Ipswich is really rather a recent discovery. It's altogether, in terms of its size, a remarkable discovery, I think.
Keith Wade, this car park you've brought us to is where the story of the rediscovery of the Saxon town of Ipswich began. I wonder just how extensive your probings have been in the past few years.
Well, not very extensive, really, in that we have really only 2 major sites. And, of course, if you think of it in terms of the total area which we know the Middle Saxon town covered, that's some 70 hectares, roughly 175 acres. It's minute. sample's actually minute. So any interpretation we put on it really is very provisional.
But you've been able to determine the size of the Saxon town because of these probings?
Yes, both that and the usual method, that is of looking at development sites while they're going on and retrieving as much as possible during the contractor's work.
What sort of things have come out of these small probings?
Well, in the main, it consists of the most common find, and that's pottery, because that's very useful, because that does give a date, and we are able to plot the expansion of Ipswich, of course not just the Middle Saxon period, the whole growth and development of the town.
Yes, how big a place? I mean, you talk about 175 acres, but how big a place was that when we're thinking in terms of the 7th and 8th centuries?
It was colossal, really. I mean, as you can imagine, the village settlements at that time were quite small, possibly a couple of hectares, an acre, that sort of size. So we're talking in the region of something 150 times bigger, quite possibly, than the rural settlements.
We've walked down through the town and down to the fairly busy waterfront of the modern Ipswich port. And from what you've been saying, Keith, it looks as though this has been a port right through from Saxon times.
Yes, that's quite true. The imported pottery we're finding on the sites comes from the Rhineland and North France, and Ipswich is on the shortest route to that area. So it's hardly surprising, really, that the material is coming from there.
Turning now to Richard Hodges, I'd like to ask you, Richard, why did it come as such a surprise that this town was as big as it is?
I think the major reason is that it's so much larger than any other site that seems to exist around the North Sea basin at this time, even larger than Dorstadt, which was always imagined to be the largest settlement of its kind at this period, the 7th to the 9th centuries. But it also stands out, of course, in East Anglia, where there are only really monastic settlements, possibly Bury St Edmunds, for example, or North Elmham in Norfolk. And there are village settlements, like, for example, West Stow, which was excavated to the north of here. And there were probably royal settlements like that associated with Sutton Hoo and its king, King Redwold. But those were all very small, and this stands out as a singularly large urban community in an otherwise non-urban environment, non-urban settlement.
Isn't it interesting that during all the excavations here in Ipswich, no coins have been found?
It is very interesting, there's no doubt about that, particularly as so many have been found in Southampton at Hamwy. But we're still very unclear about the trading of bullion at this time and the system of weights and measures that they employed. And it has to be borne in mind that whilst the trade across here was very substantial at this time, the Carolingians were equally trading to Denmark, where they would have dealt almost certainly in bullion alone as a measure of exchange. So one has a broad spectrum of exchange values, probably measured out in silver, using Germanic weights in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries. And whilst they used coins to equal those weights in Southampton or perhaps in other sites in eastern England, here they must have used raw bullion.
What sort of a trading community do you think this was then, Richard?
Well, we've already seen a great deal of evidence for artisans within the town, the potters, presumably smiths, and there would have been house builders, one assumes, and road menders, etc. Then there would have been the traders themselves, whom we assume from the historical evidence to have been Frisians, but there may have been Germans amongst them. So altogether one's got this artisan and this mercantile component, presumably administered by a king's reeve, who would have administered the estates of the king that lay, we assume, in the town. And one can imagine that when there was a large population of merchants here, he would have been here himself to have seen exactly what was going on and what they brought and what he wished to trade.
In fact, how involved would the palace or the royal household have been in this community?
Well, we assume they were very involved. The historical evidence for kings and trade at this time is growing greater all the time. We can see the relationship between each of the settlements and the kings, and in Ipswich that's perfectly clear. They directly administered the trade, the kings, we believe, because they were very concerned to regulate the flow of trade. From it they took their prestige goods, which they redistributed amongst their own population. These were a means of establishing their own status, their own prestige in an economy which as yet had not organised itself on markets.
So you think that Saxon Ipswich could have been set up literally by royal decree?
I'm certain of it. I think in the first place it would have been rather haphazard, rather ad hoc, but then it would appear by the size that it had been deliberately planned. and that it was a deliberate attempt to maximize this sort of prestige trade.
Here in the museum, we're standing in front of a case which is full of pots that are, many of them, misshapen and of a sort of black, grey, leaden sort of colour. And this is the pottery that's called Ipswich ware. Presumably it was made here, Keith.
Yes, that's true. 2 kilns have been found. Unfortunately, both were destroyed while they were being found, so we haven't actually got plans. But lots of wasters have come, as you can see, some of which are in this case.
These are the ones they throw away, the waste products.
Yes, that's right. You can see they've got cracks in them and they're misshapen. There's no shadow of a doubt, though, that this pottery was made here in extremely large quantities.
And over here in this case, this large case in front of us, we can see what was coming through Port of Ipswich. That piece up there, very large shirt, in fact, giving us an excellent impression of what that amphora must have been like.
That's right. That's a typical Bardorf type amphora. Bardorf is a village in the Middle Rhineland near Cologne, and it was one of the many villages on a low-lying set of hills that produced pottery throughout the Middle Ages. And that is the amphora that they produced there in the 9th and possibly the 10th centuries.
So that was bringing in wine to Ipswich?
Almost certainly bringing in wine. That's one of the better examples from Ipswich, in fact. And as such, they really do link Ipswich to Dorstadt at the mouth of the Rhine.
And here in another museum on the other side of the North Sea, we're looking at the complete pot, of which we've only seen just a sherd in Ipswich. Richard Hodges, this is quite a beautiful looking vessel, isn't it? The sherd gave us some promise of an excellent pot, and this one certainly is.
This is a splendid vessel. You get a complete picture of what the vessel would have looked like. It's so large in comparison to the other pots here, which were probably tablewares, pitchers that would have been used to pour the wine out and so on.
To give us some idea of where we are geographically, let's go to this wall over here where there's a splendid map showing the sort of trade that we're talking about in the 9th, 8th and 7th centuries. If we look at the spot where we're standing at the moment, it's just near Dorstadt, and it's a good 80 miles inland up the Rhine, and one wonders why a major trading centre should be located here.
It was a very strategic position, rather like modern Rotterdam, you might say. And if we look out beyond it, of course, it commanded a great area of the North Sea basin. If you look, of course, to the west, you can see it's almost directly opposite Ipswich. If you sailed straight out, you'd have virtually come to that point across the North Sea.
One can see the strategic importance of Dorstadt as a trading centre because one is looking to the hinterland where a great deal of trade must have been generated up the Rhine Valley into Central Europe.
That's right. You can see where those pots were made, for example, the so-called Bardorf type wares near modern Cologne. It's right down the Rhine, directly down the Rhine. Further down the Rhine, going southwards, there's the Mayen area where the quernstones, those milling stones, were made.
Professor Ernest, you're director of the Netherlands State Antiquity Service, and it fell to you to excavate very much of this area of Dorstadt where we are now. What sort of a town have you been discovering here?
It was a large wooden town stretched out on the left bank of the River Rhine, as it then existed. There was a narrow zone of wooden houses, commercial houses, of which we, unfortunately, do not know very much because that zone had already been destroyed before our excavation. At the back of this center of the town, if I may use that word, was the agricultural settlement, and we have excavated part of that. In front of the commercial zone, we have been excavating stretches of the harbor works in the Carolingian Rhine bed.
How do you suppose the trading operation was organized here at Dorstadt?
It's even probable that there was a specialized class of merchants which were mainly Frisians.